This afternoon's session, putting power into Northern Powerhouse, is an important part of Policy Exchange's agenda. We're very pleased to actually host this with the support of Drax. We've taken a very keen interest in the devolution agenda, and so we're very pleased to welcome you here this afternoon to examine a particular aspect of it, namely the issue of energy and the northern economy. Obviously, energy plays an absolutely critical role in any economy, and in relation to the Northern Powerhouse, unless the devolution agenda is going to operate with instruments that are going to develop a genuine, strong local economy that will give you a local tax base that can be used for revenue purposes, the whole devolution agenda, as I perceive it, will be dead. And so the Northern Powerhouse and the economic dimensions of it are very important indeed. We're going to be helped because Drax have just published this excellent publication, and we're going to be helped in getting a better purchase on it when one of our panellists who's going to lead us through that. But I think it should be noted that here in Manchester, of all places, is a sharp reminder both of our heritage and the future, because we have one of the best science and technology museums in the world, not just the country. If you go to the Manchester Museum of Science and Technology, it knocks the museum on Exhibition Road in London into a cocked hat. Now, that's partly because they've got the space to have the big trains and working steam engines and things there, but also because they lay out the hard science story, the story of the periodic table, Dalton and his gases, in a much better way than is done in most science museums. And of course, here it's at Manchester University and in the Graphene Institute that George Osborne strongly supported, that you actually see the future of material science going forward. Now, we have an excellent panel. We're going to be joined by the Minister for Bays, Claire Perry MP, a little bit later on. Drax itself is represented by Andy Koss, its chief executive, and he's really going to be the one who will ginger this one up for us. Tom Gietrix is the COO of the Nuclear Power Industry Association. He served as an MP for many years and played a very important part in the opposition team looking at energy and on the Energy Select Committee. Matthew Knight is the Director for Government Affairs from Siemens, and again, that has a very important role in producing the engineering that lies behind so much of the renewables. And we're delighted to be joined by James Wharton, who's a senior advisor at Hume Brophy, but was a MP in the northeast of England and was the government minister who took an interest, I think, in this some time ago. Now, I'm going to end by saying that Policy Exchange takes energy very seriously. We have a very strong energy team. And that energy team, about 9 months ago, identified a fundamental change in the economic structure of energy markets. And that is the movement to a flat marginal cost curve in energy. That, largely as a result of renewables, blows apart all the marginal cost pricing models we've had throughout the post-war years in the nationalisation, in the privatisations, and in the regulation of the private markets, which is really big potatoes. Now, I very much hope that Andy is going to lead us through what the purpose of the Northern Powerhouse is and how the energy agenda that he's pursuing relates to it.
Okay, thank you very much, Warwick, and thank you to everybody. I mean, we've got a very full room here, and hopefully you feel as passionately as I do about power in the north and energy in the north, and that's why you're here today. And I come at this from two angles. Obviously, I work at Drax Power. What we've done at Drax is move from being the largest carbon emitter in the UK to the biggest decarbonisation project in Europe. And we've added 1.2 billion of GVA, and we support over 14,000 jobs, of which around half of that is in the north. But also, as Warwick mentioned, I joined the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, which is chaired by George Osborne. And this is about how does the north, led by business, ensure that we get the best deal and we get the best support for what we're trying to do. And one of the prime capabilities we believe is energy. And I led the piece in the recent report, of which there are copies at the back, which sets out what our objectives are and what we're looking to for government. So why is the energy sector so important in the north? Well, the north has served as the energy powerhouse historically over time. Today, 41% of the UK's electricity generation comes from the north of England. And that is rapidly changing actually from a world of fossil fuels, so coal and gas stations, to a world of renewables and low carbon. And I did a series of workshops right the way across the north, and what came through very strongly was that we have the infrastructure, we have the skills, and we have the natural resources to continue that move from fossil fuels to renewables. And everywhere you look, over in the northwest, we have an incredibly strong nuclear industry. I'm sure Tom will cover that when he talks. Right the way over to the northeast, where we have a growing business in offshore wind, and I think Matthew will cover that from Siemens. But also, we have energy-intensive industrials along Teesside and the Humber, and challenges such as how do we decarbonise industry and thinking about carbon capture and storage. Also, the North is ideally placed to do that. So we have the infrastructure, we have the skills, and we have the knowledge. So what is it that we need to do to unlock the potential? And this was the challenge that we set ourselves when we went on these forums across the country, because I think we all know going to government and just asking for money, asking for support isn't good enough. And actually what we have to say is if government is willing to make commitments, whether it's policy or actual hard cash, business can move in behind that to support and deliver and hit the 850,000 jobs, the 100 billion of additional GVA that the North can provide by 2050. So these were the two big asks that we came up with. The first was we need to think more strategically about reusing and repurposing our existing infrastructure. As I say, the North has the most extensive energy infrastructure in the country, and we should be utilising that as we already are to continue to deliver a low-carbon energy future. Now, increasingly, and I think to Warwick's point, what we are seeing is the rise of renewables on the system, and that is great. We are hitting all our targets in terms of decarbonisation. We're seeing power prices fall, so as was mentioned, the marginal cost curve is rapidly falling out of favour. But what we are struggling with is the need for flexibility and the need for system stability on National Grid. And increasingly, National Grid are having to intervene to ensure that our power is being managed and the electricity system is stable on a second-by-second basis. So I believe both our strategy at Drax, but also more broadly across the North, is we should be using what we have to create the North's flexibility hub. And the only way to bring on more low carbon in terms of offshore wind, onshore wind and solar is to ensure we can balance that with flexible resources. So at Drax, we've switched 3 of our 6 generators to move from coal to biomass. We're also now announcing that we'd like to convert at least 1 and possibly 2 of those remaining units to run on gas. And the business case behind that is the need for increasing flexibility on the system. And as the Committee for Climate Change say, we will not hit those 2050 carbon budgets without flexibility, or if we will do so, it's going to be incredibly expensive. But I think it's not just about power where we're looking to repurpose. One of the things that we refer to in our report is Northern Gas Networks and the H21 project. So this is about moving from natural gas as the method for heating leads to potentially hydrogen, and that hydrogen being produced in a low carbon way over in the Tees Valley. So this is about pioneering work that can unlock some of the more difficult challenges around decarbonisation, such as heat and transport. Again, repurposing our assets and using what we have and using the skills that we have. Secondly, it's crucial we harness the North's research expertise. So I think Warwick mentioned the Science Museum here. The universities that we have in the north of England are absolutely superb. And they are doing an incredible amount to continue in terms of leading us in global technical and engineering skills. There are various centres for nuclear development and as well as other schemes designed around the energy system. And we are looking to actually sponsor a university, sponsor PhDs through a university to be named shortly, where we need to bring those skills forward. I think one of the things we suffer from is a dearth of engineers. Certainly I know in the nuclear industry, all the skills that we have are there today but may not be there tomorrow. And we need to continue to invest in our skills, both from schools but right the way through universities. And one of the things that we've called for in the report is a Northern Energy Centre of Excellence, so funded from the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, which brings together those universities. So in summary, the energy sector in the north is ready to lead a low-carbon revolution. Decarbonisation is not a threat, it's an excellent opportunity to repurpose what we have and use the skills in the north. And we genuinely believe the north should be at the centre of that, creating value not only for the north, but for the rest of the UK.
Now, thank you very much. I think that tees the discussion up very, very neatly. I think it would be sensible at this stage to actually ask Matthew to actually, because what really lies behind this change in the marginal cost curve is the activities that go with the green energies that you play such an important part in.
Okay, can everyone hear me as well? I'm here, I guess, as the representative of the wind industry, and particularly the offshore wind industry, but just to point out that Siemens in the north is involved in all sides of the energy industry, and we've got factories and offices in Newcastle and York and Leeds and Hull, as well as here in Manchester. The energy market, as you've alluded, has changed. I'm old enough to have been involved pre-privatisation, and whisper it quietly, but actually an energy-only market has never actually quite worked in the way that economists expected it to. In fact, it's been argued that it's never actually built a power station in this country. There's always been something else that's been needed just to trip that up. But the situation that we have now is increasingly you have zero marginal cost plant on the system, and we always had a problem with economists call the missing money problem, that there was never quite enough money in the market to build new, but there was the right amount in the market to dispatch what you had already. But as the marginal cost of things comes closer and closer to zero, or even sometimes negative, you get no signal at all to build new. But perhaps we should just talk a little bit about wind. Many of you will have seen 3 weeks ago the spectacularly low prices that came out of the latest auction for offshore wind, and that's the vindication of a lot of work by a lot of people, many of them in the north of England, that's gone on for a long time. My own personal journey with this started 14 years ago. I was working just down the road here on the Princess Road in Manchester, and I was building substations for National Grid, and somebody said, see if you can find us something to do in the renewables industry. I never went back and clarified the job description. We invested several £1 million, and we got nothing for about 3.5 years in a new fledgling industry that might or might not have happened. And then eventually we started to win, and in the end we won 5 out of the first 6 grid connections for offshore wind farms. And we pioneered an industry, and we did it from Manchester. I was asked to talk about some of the successes, but also some of the challenges. And the perpetual challenge for the wind industry has been lack of visibility of the future. All parts of the energy industry, and Tom and others will echo this, are driven by government, whether government knows it or not. Those of us who invest in energy rely on things that either government does do or doesn't do to make our business models. And we've seen the offshore wind industry go through various phases where it wasn't really clear what was going to happen in the future. And we've had several periods where there's been a bit of a gap. And for those of us in the supply chain, a gap is rather dangerous. We're now in the happy position where we've got some order books for the next few years. We've seen the costs come down and we're exporting. And that's tremendous. But I would commend to everybody the best way to build an export portfolio is to have a good, steady home market so that your businesses can invest in the first place. And perhaps I should stop there.
Well, that's very helpful. I suppose the next logical thing would be turn to Tom, because the first inkling that there may be something much more complicated than what the economists thought about the operation of power markets and generation markets was the attempts to actually develop nuclear power in the 60s and 70s. So I think this is the logical place to bring you in.
Great. Well, thanks very much. Can I firstly commend the Northern Powerhouse Partnership and Drax for this report, because as much as we maybe enjoy it, I think Matthew Andy, myself, probably get a little bit fed up with sitting on panels where we're discussing the merits of one technology versus another, rather than actually thinking about how you best get that mix that delivers on the objectives that we need. And actually, this is much more getting into, I think, a much more interesting area of discussion around place and around where these things can happen and how these things can happen in places. And just to say, in the north, the nuclear industry is, it's larger, I think, in civil nuclear industry in the UK than people sometimes think. In terms of value to the economy, it's actually as large as the aerospace industry, which I think people are quite often surprised about, and employs 65,000 people in the UK. And in areas, and the northwest of England and the north of England is where the largest concentration is. Because you've got Sellafield, and you've got around there the most advanced decommissioning workforce in the world, who are now able to export both some of their technology and their abilities around the world, and that's happening in Japan and potentially in other markets as well. You've got in and around Warrington, you've got the national labs, you've got a lot of centres of excellence for nuclear development and innovation and technology. You've got the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre just near Sheffield as well. And although Wilver is in North Wales, the North Wales economy is more closely connected to the northwest of England economy than it is to the South Wales economy. And so the potential supply chain for that project at Wilver, the Horizon project, the next large-scale new nuclear project, is very closely tied to the north of England as well. And in all of that, what we have is a combination of record, ability and presence, and opportunity. And the opportunity is to be able to continue to build and develop that supply chain, to be able to foster the innovation that we see being developed in the labs in the northwest and at the NAMRC, to apply that to future projects, whether that's large scale or, as the report highlights, the potential of small modular reactors. And the biggest challenge in all of that, I think, is around the infrastructure in the north, because we touched on skills, and I would like to often think of skills. Actually, that is about infrastructure as well. It's the infrastructure to help to develop those skills. We've got the National College of Nuclear partly sited, or will be partly sited in West Cumbria, but the opportunity to be able to properly develop that, and also the physical infrastructure. And when people think about Cumbria and West Cumbria, the ability to be able to get there and to attract people there is an important aspect of this. And there are issues there around some of that infrastructure, which I think is where the focus on the north has been, I think, very valuable in a wider public policy debate over the last few years. And I think what this report highlights is just where there are those opportunities across the whole range of the energy sector and the electricity generation industry. And we shouldn't forget, and I'll finish on this point, the wider context of this, and people will hear me say this again and again over the next few days for those who are unfortunate enough to go to other fringes that I'm speaking at. But we shouldn't forget the fact that between 2010 and 2030, in that 20-year period, 2/3 of our centrally dispatchable electricity generation capacity will have reached the end of its life. That needs to be replaced, and more than replaced, because the move from the distinction between energy and electricity diminishing, the move to more electrification in transport and heating and others in the future, means that we have a really pressing issue to address. We know that. We've known that for some time, frankly. We're starting to do it. We've heard in relation to into some technologies, and particularly in recent weeks in offshore wind and in others, that we're starting to make some progress in that. But there's a long way to go still to have that reliable, available, secure energy and electricity supply. But the opportunity is for the North to play a really significant role, not only in delivering it, but also in developing the future technologies and innovation that can help deliver it in the smartest way possible. I think it's a massive opportunity. It's one that should fit into an economic agenda beyond the UK being part of the European Union, and it's something which I think should absolutely be grasped by industry and government as well to maximise those opportunities, because I think it's really exciting about what can be done. Let's try and make at least some of it happen.
Thank you very much. I think, James, it would be very helpful if you were to comment now on the sort of way you see things progressing, having been deeply involved in it directly yourself.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm firstly to touch on some of the comments that other panellists have made. I find it hard, Tom, to disagree with anything that you've just said. That might be a worrying sign for the tone of the debate that's going to follow. We need to find some disagreement for a bit of energy. But actually, that was an intended pun, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. But actually, the truth is that this is an area of policy which is bigger than party politics. It's going to have a huge impact on the future of our country, not just on the north of our country and the economy of the north of the UK. We have, and you touched upon it much more eloquently and with many more facts and figures to hand than I would pretend to have, a economy which is going to shift dramatically towards electric vehicles if the government's policy is delivered. That puts huge and different strain on our grid. It also produces new opportunities for the way that we manage power. We have an existing generation capacity which is in many cases coming to the end of its life, and we need to look at renewal. We need to determine what the right energy mix is. And again, very carefully, the panel has agreed that there needs to be a mix, but has deftly and politically avoided discussing what that mix should necessarily look like, because we can all agree there must be a mix. There are very differing views about how that mix should be comprised. But how does this speak to the Northern Powerhouse? How do you turn some of these challenges into opportunities for the economies of the North? Well, I was appointed the first Northern Powerhouse minister in what I think was a brave step by David Cameron and George Osborne at the time to put this on the agenda front square to tackle the issue that there is huge potential that we perhaps weren't unlocking and realising in the way that we should. And I was appointed to the Department for Communities and Local Government. And people sometimes gave me funny looks as a result of that, because surely the Northern Powerhouse, some people said, was about transport. Surely some people said it was about business. Surely some people said it was about energy. Surely some people said it was about export and international trade. And there are any number of things that you could bolt onto this policy to then try to drive forward, to use the fact that the Northern Powerhouse was at the front and centre of government thinking, particularly with George Osborne, who was passionate and still has a passion for it, to use it to try to piggyback whatever your particular policy area of interest was and to push that further up the agenda and into the front of the mind of those who were making decisions. But I was appointed to communities and local government because we had one particular task to do at that time in the early days, which was to take the Devolution Act through Parliament. Whatever people might think of individual devolution deals, the principle that underpinned it was sound, which is that the Northern Powerhouse cannot be a moment in time. It can't be a single project or a single thing or something that is overnight going to transform the economies of the north of England so that we would wake up the next morning and everything would look like Singapore or something like that. That was never going to be realistic. It's a process. It was about putting in place the foundations that would allow then following the development of policy ideas and the articulation effectively of a policy agenda that would work for the north of England. Devolution was a key part of that because it was about creating the spokespeople in some of the directly elected mayors that we see, but also the powers and the organisations, things like Transport for the North, that would then do some of that heavy lifting and thinking and actually articulate what the North needed. And I remember as a North East MP going to endless debates where people would draw comparisons, for example, on the amount of public spending that goes on transport in London compared to the North East, which is somewhat incomparable. And it's somewhat incomparable primarily because of Crossrail. But the part of the story that was never told was that London advocated consistently through different administrations with a unified voice for decades to get Crossrail. Whereas the North didn't have one voice to say what it wanted. It didn't have a policy agenda that tied it together, articulated that case effectively to government, and was then consistently applying that for long enough to have the impact that's necessary to drive a change in policy. So the Northern Powerhouse fundamentally was about unlocking those ideas and creating the structures by which that discussion could take place and then be effectively communicated to government in a way that is persuasive. Andy, you said, I think quite rightly in your opening comments, just asking is not good enough. Well, in politics, just asking is never good enough. Even if it is your intention that you have settled on what you want and you've decided what it is, you have to ask over and over and over again. You have to shout louder and have a more compelling story than all of the other things that money could be spent on or that policy time and energy could be dedicated to. The Northern Powerhouse was and is about creating that space. One of the big opportunities, as we've already heard from contributions to the panel, for the north of England is energy policy. So I was delighted to accept the invitation to speak today, because when I look across the economies of the North, I see that we can have a really key role to play in this area of policy which is in a state of flux, and which is so important for the future of this country as the way we generate and the way we use our electricity is going to change. Whether it's hydrogen from the Tees Valley and what we can then use that for, the area which I was lucky enough to represent in Parliament for 7 years. Whether it's the incredible things that the great engineering companies of the North have reformed themselves to do, or new investors have come in to create in providing the product that the offshore wind industry needs and drives, and Siemens is a very good example of that. Whether it's the exciting opportunities, particularly in Cumbria, but actually across the north of England, that the renewal of the nuclear industry, whatever that might look like, presents to so many of the people who live here for good, well-paid, high-quality, high-skilled jobs and employment. There is an awful lot going on in particularly the energy economy of our country, and there is a huge opportunity for the north of England to be part of it. Part of that challenge is going to be articulating the advantages we have, that skilled workforce, that traditional infrastructure and industrial base. To be frank, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that land is cheaper in the north, and so if you want to build large industrial type complexes, there are greater opportunities. There's also a lot of brownfield land on which you can often do it. There are big, big selling points for the north of England, but we should never expect any government of any colour to just come to us and hand us on a plate the future of our economy. If we want it to be how we want it to be, we have to articulate a compelling and thought-through case consistently and over a period of time. And so I welcome very much this discussion. I think that it ties neatly into what the Northern Powerhouse is all about. It's not about handouts, it's not about someone from London telling the North what's good for it. It's about the people, the businesses, the politicians, the economy and collective communities of the north of England speaking with one voice about where our future should lie. This is a very important area which I think deserves to be part of that discussion. And I think that as we develop this policy agenda, as we look at the opportunities that exist, we could hit upon what could be one of the real drivers for the future of the northern economy. So I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion. I've been reinvigorated and enthused to hear the unanimity of the contributions we've had so far. But we mustn't forget that this is a long road to travel. And we are very lucky, therefore, particularly to have Claire here working in one of the departments and in a ministerial position that will affect the decision-making on this. Because if we in the North want the energy economy to benefit us as much as it could, we're going to have to speak with one voice over a sustained period to ensure that it does.
James, thank you very much indeed, and thank you so much for teeing up so neatly Claire, who's going to take us on the forward journey. Thank you very much.
Hasn't lost any of that political touch. Thank you very much, Warwick. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's a great report. Look, I can't disagree with anything the panel has said about the capabilities of the region, the infrastructure of the region. We can debate if the investment levels are right. I wanted to take very slight issue with James, though, because I don't think energy policy is in flux. I think we're actually at a really interesting tipping point in policy making in this area, because if you look, as you rightly said, at what's happened in the last few months, we've seen June the 7th was I think the first day where we had more than 50% of energy contribution in the UK coming from non-fossil sources. We've seen momentous falls in the price of offshore wind energy. I opened the first subsidy-free solar farm last week in Clay Hill in Bedfordshire, a combination of production and storage technology. And we're at an incredibly important point, I think, where we are clearly going to more than meet our targets for provision of renewable energy and many other aspects of the sort of decarbonisation journey. But there are really important questions to be asked going forward about cost, diversity of supply, security of supply, and sort of carbon ambitions in that area. And just to very slightly take a quick look in the rearview mirror, I was in New York last week, the UN Climate Week, listening to President Trump, amongst others. There's some very good pictures of me apparently on BuzzFeed looking deeply sceptical, according to my daughter. I just thought I had a really serious face on. But what was very striking is that if you look at what the UK has done, and I'm afraid I'm going to take Conservative or Conservative-led government credit for all of this, that's not quite true. Ed Miliband's 2008 Act was absolutely seismic in setting a sort of statutory framework that meant government had to think hard about its carbon emissions and set budgets. But if you look at what's happened in the country, we have decarbonised our economy faster and more, and grown our economy faster than any other country in the G20, according to Pricewaterhouse. And that is despite dealing with all the impact of the deficit, all the economic decisions we've taken. We've actually quietly got on with a really, really impressive journey. And one of the great strengths, both for the region and for the country, is we have a pretty diverse mix in this country. So we are not beholden to one particular technology. We're not France, which is a nuclear play, or Germany, which claims to be a renewables play, although, as the US Energy Department was keen to point out, they're just buying power from the nuclear power station on the French border, but that's their conversation. We have a legacy structure, if you like, in terms of the way that we distribute gas around the country, which means it has been not easy, but it's been relatively straightforward to try and deal with the energy going into that pipeline. We have a whole range of energy efficiency measures that are going forward. We actually have a very broad canvas on which to play, and we've done quite well at this. But going forward, just in terms of national policy, I totally accept the need for consistency and long-term signalling. That is absolutely right. Tom, it's great to see you in your position. I know it must have been difficult in all those years, both in government and opposition, to not have a consistent nuclear policy. And it's tough. It's tough for governments to take these long-term decisions, as you can see with the conversations about Hinkley. But we absolutely will bring Hinkley on board, and the conversations about the next piece of capacity are happening. We also, however, need to focus on the growth potential of the low-carbon economy. Again, I think you mentioned the nuclear industry. As I understand it, the low-carbon economy now employs about 430,000 people, directly or indirectly, bigger than aerospace. It's growing at about 10 to 12% per annum, and crucially, it's growing right across the UK. So if you want to see the power of low-carbon in terms of regeneration, go and look at Hull, go and look at the Siemens factory that's creating turbine blades there. Actually look at what that does to regenerate a local economy and create high-value jobs. And I think the future is about setting that long-term policy, but also realising increasingly it's not just about energy or transport or home energy efficiency. It's an integration of how we produce, store and use energy right across the economy. And it is so fascinating to have conversations about electric vehicles and what they will do to the grid in terms of being a storage vehicle that can then provide power back to the grid. You'll have seen the Smart Systems Plan, where we want to make sure the grid is absolutely fit for purpose. And I think it is therefore this kind of place-based, I think Tom mentioned this, the kind of place-based progress. How forward-thinking entities, regions, city regions think about this in the round and what they do to take the policies forward that will really make the difference. And a good analogy is the sort of city deal and the local growth partnerships, which started off being quite radical and have evolved, have delivered, I think, immense changes in many areas, and have become a sort of almost a textbook way of how you get the public and private sector working together. And when I think about the north, which of course goes a lot further east and west than sometimes people like to think about, that idea of what is the structure, the regulation, the incentives, the knowledge base that's already there to drive this forward. We heard a lot about the incredible academic base in the north, the industrial base that's there, the legacy base is the fact that Teesside is able to be pushing forward on carbon capture and storage or carbon capture and usage projects because they have that legacy system there, and also the brains and the will to get it done. So I think the devolution work that has gone on is absolutely vitally important. Infrastructure, I mean, I spent a lot of time both within the Shadow Treasury team and then as a rail minister kind of advocating for the North. Yes, you can thank me for the fact that you're getting replacement trains for your Pacers. It was entirely my doing. I just want to put that out there. No, but I think this sort of, thank you for the clap, this sort of expectation that we should be asking commuters to be standing on rumbling old cattle trucks effectively, or bogies on wheels, coming in and out of some of our finest cities was not appropriate, and it was really exciting to completely reshape those franchises. But we obviously need to go further, and one of the things we need to start doing, and this applies, by the way, internationally, nationally and locally, is think about how we leverage public and private capital to work together better in many of these projects. If you look at what the world needs to do to achieve its Paris targets, just in clean energy alone, there's an estimated $13.5 trillion worth of capital that needs to be deployed over the next 20 years to deliver that change in energy investment. Within the UK, we are talking about hundreds of millions, billions of pounds worth of public and private capital. I announced last week my new Green Finance Task Force, which is an attempt to bring together the best and brightest minds right across the financial services sector to look at new structures for retail, institutional and commercial activities, so we can really solve some of those problems here, and by the way, export that knowledge and expertise to the world. And it's the same in the north. I mean, we have the Northern Powerhouse Investment Fund, as I understand it, which is now constituted and ready for business. How we can link those pools of capital along with reinvigorated regions or cities that want to actually drive forward a change in their energy policy, and linking it into the fantastic industrial base and knowledge base that we have in the north. I think that is how we continue to put the power in the Northern Powerhouse.
Claire, thank you very much indeed. I think the panel has done us proud. They've given us a clear picture of what sometimes when outsiders look in are not certain what it's about. It's a complex story, the Northern Powerhouse. I'm sure we've got lots of questions, and I'll take them in threes, I think. So, gentleman there. And two questions over there.
Thank you. It's Gavin Miller from Institution of Civil Engineers. I'm just interested, I think the only two times that heat has been mentioned by the panel there is in the context of hydrogen, H21 and also Tees Valley as well. But to decarbonise with hydrogen, you really need to have CCS, which is a difficulty given that the government cut the CCS competition last year. So just wondering on the panel's views at how CCS could come forward in that context, and unless there is any other government support coming ahead.
Thank you. Two over there.
Thank you. I'm John Levinson. I'm a party member and activist and branch chairman within Edisbury and also campaign director of Go Cashless. I think this may be an unpopular thing to say, but the Northern Powerhouse, it needs, and the regional airports in the north, Manchester, Liverpool, John Lennon Airport, need a third runway at Heathrow, and we need HS2. And the other part of my question is, you talk about how the Northern Powerhouse, which we all know, needs energy, it needs infrastructure, and it needs investment, and it's been touched on as opportunity and workforce, but it's about people more than anything else. And my question really is about the skills. We've talked that we have the skills. Do we really have a proper pipeline of skills, especially in engineering and IT? At the previous Fringe meeting today, where there was a government minister there was one alarming statistic that in computer science GCSEs, there were only 604 girls that sat the exam nationally. It would be alarming if that was just in the Northwest, but that's the national figure. So
that's a very striking note in which to challenge the panel, and I suggest we get the next question behind.
Harry Wilkinson, I'm a member from Weybridge. My question is firstly to Siemens, which is, have the capital costs on this one project really come down by 50%, unlike anywhere else? Or is this some sort of a ploy? Because we know how high the profits have been in the wind industry. And to the ministers, we hear all the time costs are supposedly coming down, but when will actually the subsidies paid start coming down as well? Because I think that's what lots of hard-pressed energy bill payers would like to see happen as well. And is 30 trillion, which I think you mentioned, to meet the Paris targets, is that really a level of funding that's commensurate to the actual problem?
Thank you very much indeed. Now, if we work across the panel, because I know different members of the panel will be game to comment on certain things and certain things they may not be as interested in, why doesn't Siemens lead us off?
Okay.
I saw a lot of interest.
I'm delighted to say that the UK prices for offshore wind are part of a trend that is global, and it's a trend that's driven by some very hard, really solid investment in larger turbines, in skills, in bigger jack-up vessels, a reduction in the cost of capital because we deliver on time and on budget, and 50 other things that go into that. that really have taken the cost of offshore wind right down, actually, to be frank, faster than even enthusiasts for the industry like me thought was possible a few years ago. So that's a good news story, really good news story. As to the I forget how many trillions we were talking about, we are destroying our planet, and the way the greenhouse effect works, the more carbon dioxide that goes up into the atmosphere and the other greenhouse gases, it acts like a greenhouse, and it goes on acting like a greenhouse for hundreds of thousands of years to come. We have to get to net neutrality very, very soon as a planet. Otherwise, we all fry together. We all drown together, and we need to accept that it's the policy of this government, and it crosses all parties, it crosses almost every country on the planet. We need to decarbonise, and the great news is, actually, that's going to cost us a lot less than we thought it was going to, and that Lord Stern forecast.
Sorry? Tom?
Just quickly, I'm in danger of lapsing into one of my previous lives, but on CCS, I mean, I think particularly in relation to industrial emissions, then I can't think of any way other than with CCS that you're going to do that if you want to protect the integrity of some of those industries, which also play a crucial role in the supply chain of everything else that we've been talking about today. So I hope that's something that is able to be, is able to be thought about again and find a way of being able to progress that. On the point around skills and people, well, it is absolutely agree with you. It is about people, and the opportunities are about the opportunities for people. And the National College for Nuclear, which was something that was announced in the coalition years, I think, with part of its siting in the northwest, is going to be critical to be able to develop and build those skills, because we have an issue in the nuclear industry, two issues. One is an ageing workforce, and the second is there's a gap between those who are getting towards retirement age, and we've got a reasonably good cohort of people who are younger and have come into the industry recently, but not very much in between. And how you manage to get those, to get that experience maintained in your workforce is going to be really important. And we spend a lot of time trying to help to encourage people into STEM subjects as an industry and our members constantly, and in schools as well, starting really from primary school age, and particularly with girls, to try to help to meet that demand, to get people interested in the opportunities that exist in science and technology related subjects. Because I think, I've got twin daughters who are nearly 8 years old, and I spend my whole time trying to encourage them to be interested in science, because I don't want them to repeat my experience of doing a general arts degree and ending up in a bizarre world. I want them to actually be doing something that helps to contribute to society and what we need to do as a country and more widely to meet the challenges we have. And that's an ongoing thing that I think every industry actually that's involved should be continuing to work on, because without that, we're not going to get anywhere near achieving what we need to achieve.
James?
Yeah, thank you. Some really interesting questions. I mean, I'd like to start with link the CCS and the wind, which is a great politician's way. I'm a former politician of avoiding answering either. I believe in markets. Okay, I think that market is one of the most powerful drivers of innovation, of productivity, of the things that have made our society and all Western society and capitalist society as successful as it is. I recognise, though, at the same time that the energy market is not a completely free market. There are significant numbers of distortions in it. And even setting that to one side, I accept that markets sometimes need a certain element of intervention in order to function in the way that produces the maximum utility. And the principle on which, of course, we subsidise some of the newer or renewable technologies was to make them affordable. It was to create a market in which people would innovate to be able to make cheaper solar panels, because there was no market. The very expensive, inefficient old solar panels wouldn't be sold, so nobody would bother innovating. Wind, similarly, we needed to create an environment in which, and we can argue about whether the subsidies were at the right level or not, we needed to create an environment in which there was a market for wind in order to get people to invest in it, to drive innovation, to lead us to having more efficient, cost-effective generation capability, capacity, technology. And so I think that we can't just say, well, wind is too expensive or the subsidy is too much, and we can argue about when we reach parity of the figures and the capital investment that is required. But it is unarguable that the cost has been coming down quite significantly, and I think that is welcome. That leads us to the CCS question, because there is a question that remains over whether CCS can be done without subsidy or whether it needs that government competition element, that government investment to kickstart what may or may not be a bit of a game changer in terms of carbon emissions and the way that we produce our energy. I don't pretend to have all the answers to that, but I think we need to continue to look very carefully at it. Teesside, where I'm from, was one of the sort of leading potential sites for this, and they still have a collective of companies that are looking at it, that are working on it, that are keen to be part of it. I think there's a lot of exciting opportunity there, but I'm not going to sit here and say, therefore, we should throw a load of government money at it, because I'm not the expert. I need to be very careful where we spend public money, particularly in this time when we still have a deficit to deal with, lest we forget, when we still have big economic challenges that we face despite our successes. And finally, and I'm going to enjoy for a moment not being a member of the government, not even an MP, never mind a minister, on the questions of Heathrow third runway. I think we should get on with it because I think it's important, particularly for the airports of the north, but actually if we are to remain a globally competitive economy, it is very difficult to justify taking so long to take such an important infrastructure decision, almost whatever that decision is going to be in the outcome of it. On an HS2, look, I've got some scepticism about the cost of HS2. But I think it's really welcome that we saw yesterday the announcement that as we're doing HS2 and the government is committed to doing it, the government's now committed £300 million to ensuring the North sees extra benefit from it by connecting a lot of those areas and towns that otherwise wouldn't have been able so easily to connect in with the route. That's important both for what's being delivered with HS2 as it stands today, but also what we might want to do for the future for those who are interested in transport for the North and might want to advocate for the HS3 idea and project as something for the future.
Andy.
Let me come on to CCS because I mean Drax was part of the White Rose project and we were one of the two projects in the competition before it was pulled. And I mean I'm a big fan of CCS. I think for the north as well, we have the storage sites, we have the energy intensive industries. So if you want to decarbonise, building these clusters, and I think that is the key to bringing the costs down. It's building pipelines and infrastructure around clusters, which, again, the north around Tees and the Humber can do. And we wait with interest the government's response to Lord Oxborough's report. And I was really encouraged, Claire mentioned CCS, and maybe we'll see something in the Clean Growth Plan. And back to my earlier point on flexibility, the additional cost of trying to hit our carbon targets in the future without flexibility or without CCS, the Committee for Climate Change reckon is around £30 billion. So I do think for heat and for power generation in the future, that's important. The other thing I just wanted to touch on was skills, the question on skills. And this is something that the Northern Powerhouse Partnership are looking at. And what's really interesting about schools in the north, that at primary school level, people's attainment is at the national average, but at secondary school it falls far below. And I think trying to understand what is happening there at secondary school is really important for the UK, but particularly for the North, and making sure we encourage our school children to go into the right subjects, stay on at school, get their qualifications, because there is a dearth, particularly in STEM skills, of children coming through and reskilling what are important industries for the North. I think the other thing as well is around retraining, and it's something we talked about at the launch of the report on Friday. How do we take our existing workforce, so people in their 40s and 50s who are not that close to retirement, but how do we give them the skills and retrain them in a low carbon economy and give them future opportunities? I think that's as important as ensuring our school pupils do better.
Claire.
Thanks. So 3 great questions. So I will be saying something about CCS and the Clean Growth Strategy, but I'm afraid you have to be a little bit patient, just a little bit longer. But I wanted to sort of broadly touch on it. So first of all, you're quite right. Heat is about 33% of the country's emissions, both domestically and across the business sector. There is no magic bullet. I mean, there are, how you can obviously decarbonise some of the sources of heating, but we have questions around distributed heating. There really is no one lever we can pull to do this. It is a simple grind through a whole series of policy initiatives. And actually having heat networks working properly would be a huge benefit, and actually place-based heat networks, which we actually understand what are the barriers to stopping us using waste industrial heat over into domestic or indeed public buildings, which doesn't happen as often as it should, is a really important piece of work, and we are continuing to fund the heat networks investment. But I will say this about CCS, because I have been looking closely. So there are about 21 commercial scale plants globally operating, and 16 of them rely on using the CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, which is not a technology that works for us in the UK. And that is the way that those plants, you might disagree, I'm told it doesn't. That is the way those plants are actually able to operate without enormous subsidy. So there is a real question to be asked about what is the technological breakthrough we want in CCS? How do we capitalise on, again, what the UK has, which is a fantastic knowledge and experience based in this area, and how do we best deliver it in a way that both helps us decarbonise but also helps the world solve this problem? Because I detected no appetite last week amongst other countries, including Canada and Norway, for very substantial government investment into this if there wasn't the enhanced oil recovery revenue stream. And by the way, I think there is an opportunity for bilateral working in this. I mean, we have done a lot of work in this area. We've spent, as you know, hundreds of millions of pounds, and trying to draw it together in a way, as we did with offshore wind, to really focus on a cost number that we want to hit might be a way forward. The gentleman talking about, look, I agree with you about infrastructure. We are great in this country at coming up with every reason why we should never build substantial infrastructure, and it is unbelievably frustrating because clearly HS2 runway expansion benefits all parts of the UK. And it is fascinating that when you actually pick apart the runway objections, a lot of it is to do with road-based emissions, actually getting to and from the runway, which then you then start thinking about how much more creative could we be as we start to move to a diesel-free world and actually trying to solve that problem. And so I think there's a lot of good work that needs to go there. And yes, look, in all sectors I've ever worked in, including rail, where only 5% of the train drivers are women. Women are woefully underrepresented in the massive growth areas of the future. And I will say one thing, and this relates a bit to the sector deals, which we're not going to talk about, but the industrial strategy is very much bringing forward. What tends to happen with asks for skills is that people get together and say, we must upskill, we must have lots more digital engineers, and therefore you must put this on the national curriculum, and it must displace, PSHE, whatever it is. That's a really difficult thing to do, right? Because we keep, there are lots of reasons why you don't want to change the national curriculum. The best sector deals are thinking really hard about how they solve their own problems. How do we create another 10,000 people who are able to work in the auto sector in terms of on the manufacturing floor, and how do we solve that problem ourselves? And I was at Myra last week near Nuneaton, who have done some fantastic work in working with the local educational institutions, the universities, the colleges, to say how do we actually home grow these people that we want to work in this really important sector. And we are completely up for those sorts of deals. For too long, I think people looked to government and said, you solve the problem of skills. That's not how the North was built. The North was not built on local leaders lobbying government for what they needed on the curriculum. It was about going out and growing and investing in the talent that you needed. And one of the very, I won't name him and shame him, but one of our leading northern universities basically said to me, you're not asking nearly enough from your third sector organisations. You should be coming to us and saying, how do you help us create these skill sets, rather than always relying on the government to push this through from the curriculum. I'm not trying to dodge the responsibility, but if we know we have specific needs in the economy, let's go for it. Look, the argument about it's 13.5 trillion, by the way, is the number. Look, what I've been sort of starting to say on this is we don't have to make these trade-offs. This is not about massive subsidy for technology forever. This is about, as we have done, by the way, with fossil fuel industries for years, about targeted subsidies that then deliver a result, and where we rapidly move to a market-based solution, as we have done actually very effectively with offshore wind in this country. And, it is amazing to me. This is not just the UK talking, but every other country, even post the Trump's withdrawal, which, by the way, can't technically happen until 2020. There is no slackening in appetite amongst the world's leading economies, to reduce the pace of innovation and investment in this, because people understand if you look at the growth rate coming from this economy going forward, it is much, much higher than the conventional economy. And by the way, from a conservative point of view, one of the things we have always been been, look at Mrs. Thatcher's speech on this way back, one of the first speeches that actually acknowledged the impact of human activity on the climate and set out a conservative approach, that stewardship approach of our environment and our world. And frankly, it's something we have been really good at, and I don't think we celebrate that nearly enough.
Claire's absolutely right. The industrial strategy is very, very important. And that enables me to remind you, we've got some wonderful policy exchange papers at the back, including a very good one on industrial strategy, a very good one on heat itself. And I think it's time for a couple more questions, but snappy, quick questions. Gentleman at the front and gentleman over there.
Thank you. Very interesting to hear about all the renewables and the greener and the cleaner stuff that's coming out, the percentages that's now being used. I come from Blackpool, my wife and I come from Blackpool, we're councillors up there, and we have a slight problem up there at the moment with a certain firm in fracking. I just want to ask the panel, how does fracking sit comfortably with you, with what you're talking about at this moment in time?
Very neat question. Another one over the back there.
Hi, Guy Miss Campbell, WPI Economics and formerly Policy Exchange. We were talking just about skills, and obviously the North, there's not just a problem with STEM skills in the UK, but the North also has a well-documented problem with the most qualified and most skilled people leaving, going to London, and then never really returning. So my question to the panel is, do you think it's a case, talking about the energy sector specifically, where build the job opportunities and people then come? Do you think it's that build the overall opportunities that come from the Northern Powerhouse and hope they'll come? Or do you think there need to be other steps that are North-specific to help not just train the right skills within the education system, but make sure they're in the right places in the country? Thank you.
Now, I think we're getting towards the end of our time, and to actually have a sensible response from the panel, and for them to have a sort of final word about how to set our cap straight to go forward, I'll ask them each to sort of sum up in a sort of valedictory way as they answer the two questions. So, Tom, would you like to kick us off on that?
Okay, fracking, well, look, I mean, I think we are going to continue to need gas, certainly in the medium term, for electricity and for heating. There's a question about where you get that gas from, and you know, what is the most sensible, appropriate, sustainable way of doing that. I think, frankly, on fracking that there has not been enough yet assurance to people, or people feel comfortable with that is is one of the ways of doing it. I think hopefully that we'll get to that position, because it doesn't make any sense to me to say that you would you want to import lots of LNG from lots of other places when you may have a resource here, but we don't know what we've got. We should get on with doing the assessment and the exploratory work to see what that resource is, and then make a judgment from there, is what I would think is a logical approach to that. On skills and people moving to London and to the southeast away from the north, the constituency with the highest proportion of PhDs in the country is in Copeland, because of the nuclear industry.
Yeah.
And you know, I think there is a lot to say that actually, where you've got those centres of excellence, where you've got the opportunity, then people will want to stay if they can, or lots of people want to stay if they can. I think too often people feel as though they don't really have very much choice. The opportunity is to give them that choice, and I think there's a lot that can happen there. I think that point really speaks to my wider conclusion in relation to this report, which is there is a lot that has to happen in energy. There's a lot that has to happen in our infrastructure in the relatively near future. There's a lot that we can build on that happens and has happened and can continue to happen in the north of England. And I think we're in danger. We should avoid the danger of missing that opportunity, because I think it can have a massive impact economically across the whole of the country, and actually be a force of good, not just for the north of England, but for the rest of the country as well.
James.
Two, I think, very good pertinent questions. On fracking, I'm in principle support it. I think that we of course need to ensure that it's safe. We of course need to ensure it's done properly. It also needs to pay for itself. It needs to be able to deliver cost effectively, which is not as straightforward with current energy prices and oil prices, therefore gas prices, as it was. It needs to be self-sustaining. That said, we shouldn't hinder it with undue delay and burden either, and sometimes the planning process can be too convoluted and slow, and whilst we have to ensure proper safety conditions are met and they've properly understood the impact of what we're doing, we also don't want to tie up companies in knots, partly because this has an impact on the price of energy, and partly because this has an impact on the security of supply. And we live in an uncertain world. We can see that supplier nations, we can only need to look to some of our neighbours in Europe and what the global policy positions they have found themselves having to take because they're dependent on suppliers that are not always reliable, if I can put it that way, thinking about countries like Russia and how they use energy supply as a political tool, to see some of the value in the security of supply that this could potentially unlock. So we need to be sure it's safe, of course, but that doesn't mean tying it up in an endless process, which means that it will never happen. But it does need to be self-sustaining and self-funding. And on the issue of skills, I couldn't agree more. I think skills are one of the really big challenges. You look at, in Teesside, one of the big industries is chemical process. You look at the number of people in their 50s in very important senior jobs that are keeping that industry running effectively. And then you look at the curve of employment below that, and you wonder where in 20 years' time we're going to get the people with those skills to remain competitive and to continue to have that part of our economy function as well as it does today. So it is true, I've always believed in build it and they will come. The challenge of some of this is the timeframes that we're talking about. It takes time to train these people. And we have to create the desire in the younger population to be a chemical engineer, to be an engineer of whatever type, to take on some of these roles. I think we're getting better at that. But you go to places like Germany, I know it's often said, but it is true, being an engineer has very high social status. It's a bit like being a doctor in the UK. Well, the number of parents I've met who want their kids to be doctors, I lost count on. The number who say, I want my child to be an engineer, somewhat fewer. We need to address that. We're working on it. But do you know who's going to fix that, really? I mean, government can do a bit, and think tanks can do a bit, but it's the industry. The industry needs, and I know it recognises the problem, but it needs to be more proactive in going out there and saying to young people who are making these decisions, here is the exciting and well-paid professional career that you can have if you follow this route. We need to see more of that and to encourage more of that. Government has a role in it, but ultimately it's up to industry, I think, in no small part to drive it. And that ties in a summing up kind of way to what the Northern Powerhouse is supposed to be all about. It's about giving people, regions, businesses, areas, economies, the tools that they need to drive forward for themselves. Don't wait for someone to do it for you. I say to people in those industries that are wondering about this challenge, go out and start and engage and do it for yourself. And if the government puts hurdles in your way, if the process puts hurdles in your way, raise them, challenge them, and break them down. That's what politicians should be there for. But don't wait for someone to do the job for you, because Conservatives, that's what we believe in, going out and sorting out your own problems. But that applies to industry just as much as it does to individuals.
Matthew.
Economics is really good at deciding how you deal with incremental changes and small perturbations. And energy is going through a massive step change, a huge revolution, a transformation. Decarbonisation is just one of the 4 Ds. The others are digitalisation, democratisation, and decentralisation. And all of those things come together in the energy space at the moment. And those of us who are in that world know what those mean. Just to touch on the digitalisation for a moment. We talked about skills and the need to give people the sort of computer science, digital literacy skills. Digitalisation is not about designing better video games. Digitalisation is chopping up every single value chain in every area of business that you've ever heard of or dealt with and reassembling it in a completely different way. And if your business, if our country is not ready to get involved in that and seek out the new places where the value occurs in the value chain, and that may mean it cuts out lots of incumbents and lots of business models that we used to have, then we are not going to succeed in the modern world. So it's not a case of should we get these skills, should we encourage people towards them. It's about waking up to the need that if we don't, we will get left behind. And energy is as good an example of that as anything else. So much happens, as we call it, beyond the meter, behind the meter now. By the time we've rolled out smart meters in this country, they won't really be doing the job that they were designed to do. They'll be catching up after the event because everything will be happening in apps and online. And I think one of the challenges, and Claire mentioned it beautifully, that Conservatives should have a great reputation for environmental stewardship and good management of things, but unfortunately, there are a small number of very noisy people who bang on about stuff that has been discredited, disproven and debunked so long ago. And the rest of you need to have the confidence to just ignore the climate change deniers and get on with talking about what real conservatism is about and what it is going to do for the country. Get behind the people who are building the green, the digital, the decentralised economy that this country needs to have.
Anthony, you've done a very good bit of waking up.
Yeah.
What are your final thoughts for us?
Well, I think in answer just to answer the questions and then summarise. So I think on gas, I would echo what some of the other panellists said. I think we need to broaden the debate. Gas is needed, I think, over certainly the near to medium term for flexibility. And I think to the security of supply point, the fact is that North Sea reserves are falling at a remarkable rate. And I think it is about security of supply, and I think we need to get the balance right when we do think about shale. I think on the infrastructure, how do we encourage people to stay in the north? I mean, there is currently a net emigration of students who study in the north and then go south. And we've talked a bit about the opportunities, which I think is key. I also think it's also about work-life balance and quality of life as well, which I think the north can offer. But I think people want to go on a train or commute between cities and be able to move quickly, comfortably, have Wi-Fi access. And if I just give you my example, I came over from York today, sort of 40, 50 miles, took an hour and a half, and my internet signal was pretty intermittent all the way here. These are the things I think that will increasingly affect people and their quality of life. So I think it is about the opportunity, but it's also about quality of life and infrastructure. And I suppose to summarise, I think as the report shows, I think the North is incredibly well placed, particularly on energy, to deliver what the UK needs in terms of decarbonisation, in terms of flexibility, in terms of jobs. I think we need, I think to your point, James, we need to continually press that message home and stand ready with businesses to stand behind policy and deliver what I think the North can do in great scope and in quantity, and for the UK as a whole rather than just the North.
Thank you very much. Claire.
Thanks, Warwick. Can I just ask your views on fracking? Because you're sort of on the front line at the moment.
Well, my views are quite straightforward. It's there, so whether I like it or not, it is there, and I don't think there's any government would ignore it.
Yeah.
It's just causing a lot of problems, and my views are it's cost us over $2 million from the council.
Exactly.
The other aspect has just gone out of my head. Oh yes, how much is it getting into local economy?
Yeah. I mean,
I don't think it's very much. How much of the locals are being employed in fracking? I think they bring their own people in, and it doesn't really touch on.
And there's a security one. No, I mean, I think thank you very much. I mean, to me, fracking is one of those things that we need to understand and use, and the evidence base, and I believe in facts that suggests that if done properly in a well-regulated environment, this is a safe form of technology. But how will we know the size of this and the opportunity to innovate unless we do it? And so I find it sort of odd that people who are particularly certain advocacy groups who want us to believe very strongly the science of climate change, which obviously I do believe, don't want us to understand the science of fracking and also work out ways to innovate so that we could actually generate something where the UK leads the world in this technology for other countries. So I just find it perverse, and I know communities have had a really, really hard time of it. And, roads being closed by protesters, children not being taken to hospital, that is a disgraceful way to try and influence policy in a democracy, in my view. So I'm sorry you've had to represent communities. But it is important, by the way, that the planning framework is in place to enable local communities to make those planning decisions. And when it comes to solar farm clustering or onshore wind or fracking, we have now got, I think, a pretty good, robust planning process that does allow local communities to, say not, we don't want this, or we're prepared to look at it. Secondly, on the point about how to make the North great, look, I mean, there's been 500,000 jobs created since 2010. One of the fastest rates of job creation is happening in the northeast. There are some enormous success stories. Tom's point about the deep clustering of certain industries is hugely important. But as James said, there's a little bit of advocacy that's required. And I don't know how many people in this room like me go between Manchester and Birmingham. every year for the different conferences. And Birmingham has done a really good job of advocating itself, partly on the back of the HS2 connection, and now is the #1 destination for people leaving London to go and settle. They've managed to create this praise that this is somewhere to live, the transport links are coming, there are lots of jobs, there's lots of opportunity. There's been a real kind of advocacy going on. And I know the North is, we talk about the North, it's an enormous region, there are so many different areas to it, but so rich in terms of its offering. And the thing that does strike me is if you look at the polling that came out yesterday about the #1 or #2 topic for young people, it is climate change. And people, as we said, don't think the Conservatives have a very good policy engine. I would defend that and say that is just, 99% of the solar installation in this country has been installed since we came in 2010. We have had an enormous impact. However, here's a pitch for you. You want to be involved in solving the world's problems for climate change. Here is a whole series of industries setting up in the North, operating in the North, great places to live, wonderful national parks to go and be part of. It's not the Northern Powerhouse, it's the Northern Greenhouse. You can have it for free. But the point of this is there is this immense opportunity. People do want to work in a way that contributes to the greater good, particularly in this area. And there is an incredible opportunity, I think, for persuading people. Keele University, doing astonishing stuff, really innovative things happening up there, and trying to get their graduates to stay and work and live in the area. And we need the well-paying jobs and the infrastructure for them to do that. And my final point is do advocate for HS3, because it is just shocking that our east-west connections are so woeful, and we have this astonishing rate of job growth in Newcastle. Carlisle's still struggling for long-term sustainable employment, and a rail journey that is like nothing on earth to get across. We have to get some east-west high-speed, high-quality connectivity, and I think that really does start to unlock opportunities. But Northern Greenhouse, I think you should try it.
Well, Claire, that's a brilliant way, a very strong note to actually end. But I think it's been a very interesting panel discussion. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you very much for supporting it. And thank you. You can't do this unless you've got an audience who comes, joins you, asks the questions, and G's you up. So thank you very much. Thank you.